Well, it's Christmas Eve, and during the most wonderful time of the year, at least it's supposed to be, but indeed this year has not been wonderful. In fact, it's been extraordinary in the most possible way you can imagine. And usually by now, people would be preparing to see loved ones and getting ready for Christmas parties. But because of the coronavirus pandemic, we have to stay away, isolate, meet people virtually by and large. And it's definitely been a tough time. It still is a tough time, especially over the festive period, when people who have lost loved ones to the pandemic will obviously be missing those dear ones. So how do we cope with all of this? To tell us more, I'm joined now by clinical psychologist at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, SADAG, Charity Mkone. Charity, good morning. Thanks so much for speaking to us.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
So we know that, this year has really been horrible. We cannot meet our loved ones in the ways that we traditionally used to do. So many people have lost loved ones to this pandemic. So many people have lost their lives and their livelihoods as a result of the lockdowns that were imposed as a result of COVID-19. How do we cope with all that we have had to deal with, all the loss, and then there's still the uncertainty and the loneliness and even resentment over what has happened over this festive period?
I mean, this year's holiday season will no doubt be very different. And I think in all the things that you've spoken about and all the things that you've mentioned is the feelings that come up for that are very characteristic of grieving. Because I think what you mentioned and all the factors that you mentioned have been people have witnessed and experienced all sorts of losses, that there's been losses on every level for a lot of people. And this has been a traumatic year. So it is very difficult to be able to celebrate the holiday season, or the festive season as you know it, will not be as festive. So I think the first thing to do is just to register this as a trauma, that this has been a very traumatic year that has been filled with a lot of losses. And what we're going through, what we're all going through globally, is just a deep state of mourning and a deep state of grief of all the things that we've lost, of all the loved ones that we've lost. And I think it is important to first register that before we can go on to trying to find different ways of coping or different ways of doing things differently in this very difficult time.
Charity, when you say we should register it, and it may sound, something that's pretty obvious, but how do you go about doing that? You think of people who, at the beginning of this pandemic, were perhaps, living their best lives. They were well off. They had well-paying jobs. As an example, you look at, say, workers of SAA, SA Express, and there are, of course, many others. I'm just using this as an example, who had good jobs, and suddenly they find themselves having gone now 8 months without receiving a salary. You've gone from a life that was good and certain to not knowing where your next meal is going to come from. So how do you start in terms of just processing all of that?
Certainly, I think what you're mentioning and what you're speaking about is that this is a time of uncertainty. So there's a deep level of uncertainty. And the first thing to do when we feel uncertain is that we panic. It's a natural response that we have. It puts us in a state of panic. And I think the first thing to do is to imagine how you can reboot your life. So the same way that you would do for devices or computers when things are not as they should be, you switch everything off and you try and reboot to try and get it back sometimes to what we call factory settings. And things like that, I think in very practical ways that people can practice that or do that is by doing a lot of things that involve them working with their bodies or with their hands. So what we do in terms of uncertainty is that we become very phobic or very scared, and then we want to fill our heads with knowledge, then we will go into information overload. We'll read on the statistics and all those things. So part of rebooting, particularly in this time, is to try and stay away from the news, because a lot of things will be bad. So try and limit the time that you spend reading up on or finding things that are happening, and try and spend more time outside. We take for granted just how much nature can help in that. So I think very simple things in trying to reboot and trying to simplify lives without necessarily not feeling the emotions or not feeling the feelings that come with all the things or the various circumstances that people have found themselves in. So the first and most important one is to reboot. So whatever rebooting means to different people, that's what you need to do. But I think more fundamentally is to try and simplify our lives and to reduce and keep to a minimum the information that we absorb or the information that we take in with regards to what is happening with the pandemic. And of course, to stay abreast and keep abreast with the developments, but to not consume all that information, because what it does, it just builds on the negativity, and it becomes very difficult then to overcome the despair that a lot of people might be feeling at this time.
Now, Charity, additionally now, this is a time of year when a lot of people would travel home to be with family members and loved ones, and most cannot do that for various reasons. And, you may be in a hotspot area at this time and it's not safe to travel. How do you now cope with being lonely as someone who traditionally would be surrounded by family members and loved ones at a time like this?
I think one thing to bear in mind is that having to social distance or not being physically present with those that you love does not mean social disconnection. So technology, in as much as it can be a disadvantage at times, is also a big advantage in that we have multiple platforms where people can connect to their loved ones, and people can be able to have Zoom calls, Skype, and all the other social media platforms that are available to connect with their loved ones. And I think it is important to really reach out to a support system. And I think in times where things feel so uncertain and so despairing, it's important to factor in and make a conscious decision to reach out to a support network. So doing things like writing down days and times where you will call someone and let someone know who is your loved one or someone you consider to be a support system, that you'll be reaching out to them, particularly when things get difficult. And put it in a diary, write it down so that you commit to a time where you can connect to people and you can be able to, even if it's not ideal that you're seeing people in person, but even if you're on your own, to make your Christmas meal or cook or whatever it is, and then have your lunch over Zoom. So make it a date with either loved ones or people, if you have access to those social medias, and do that. Because I think the social disconnection is what is very hard at this time. So it needs to be scheduled into our time and something that we do very consciously, so that the social isolation or having to social distance doesn't mean that you're socially disconnected. And it's very important to enlist people who you think or who you consider to be your support system, and make those people aware of how you're feeling and what you're going through on a regular basis, and also schedule calls where you can reach out to people, one or two that you consider to be a support system to you.
Charity, let's talk for a moment about feelings of resentment over this period. And, as mentioned earlier, things like sudden joblessness, or even for people who have been jobless for a while, there are the issues of financial ruin, the death and destruction, downgrading in lifestyles that so many people have had to endure. So there are many hardships that people are facing at the moment because of the pandemic. And you are obviously going to feel bitter and even rageful at some point, especially as we edge closer to a new year, to 2021, when generally people tend to take stock of what happened during this previous year. So how do we prevent ourselves from falling into this trap of anxiety and depression as a result of those feelings of resentment?
Hmm. I think when it comes to feelings, it is quite counterintuitive because a lot of people feel like the so-called negative emotions, or the emotions that you spoke about around resentment, rage, anger, are things that should not be felt, and we should avoid them and try to manage those feelings. But feelings are like a wave, and when they come, it is because they're trying to give us information. So feelings are like a wave that you need to ride when they arise, and they are there as signposts to what is going on. So it's an appropriate response to have anger. It's an appropriate response to be rageful at life, at whatever it is that you believe in, because it has been quite an unfair time for a lot of people, and a time of deep difficulty where it's just unrelenting, and it does feel like it's not stopping anytime soon. So those emotions that you mentioned are appropriate to feel given the circumstance and given where people are, where a lot of people are. And I think the first and what might sound like counterintuitive advice is to be able to feel those feelings. And feelings, like I said, are waves. They don't last. They come in, and it does sometimes feel very intense, but they go. And what happens is, if you don't allow yourself to feel those emotions, it becomes difficult to then process what is going on. And then it develops into being an anxiety or something of a more serious or more concerning mental health disturbance. So it is to be able to process those feelings and understand that feelings and emotions pass. The circumstances might remain how they are for quite some time, but the feelings and the emotions that come through are as a response to what's been happening, and you need to feel them in order to be able to process what's happening, and in order to be able to move on and respond in a way that's appropriate to what this year has been, or the changes and the losses that you've experienced in this year.
And then, of course, we generally also do tend to focus this time of year on matriculants charity because of, this milestone event in their lives. And they too may feel, this year more acutely because they cannot celebrate their school leaving like everyone else has done traditionally. And, whether it's because of FOMO, the fear of missing out, or just the fact that this has just been such a tumultuous year. You're not going to see your school friends anymore. You don't have the opportunity to party with them one last time. What do you say to matriculants who are, of course, also dealing with quite a lot, and we've had to deal with this on the show here, where there was the uncertainty of papers having to be rewritten, and we had matriculants sending us messages, calling and saying that they will take their lives. So they've had to deal with a lot as well. Those results for this year's matric exam delayed until February. What can you say to them just to keep them, rooted at this point?
I think, like you say, it's been a very difficult time for them. And I think for them, the message is more to the caregivers, the parents, the people around them, to be able to practice a lot of kindness and compassion in recognizing just how difficult this year is. Because in our schooling career, we all look forward to being in matric. It is something that epitomizes our journey of being students, of being learners. And there's a lot of milestones and things that they've missed out on, particularly socially, that mark this rite of passage. So I think the onus is upon the adults in those young people's lives and the caregivers to be very compassionate and kind to them, and for the actual matriculants themselves to also be very kind and compassionate to themselves, and also find things that really bring them pleasure or things that they enjoy doing, and try and do more of those things. And of course, it is difficult, once again, with all the COVID-19 protocols that need to be observed. But I think things like being outside, things like dancing, baking, and I think the biggest boost for all of us that are going through this is to think back perhaps on activities that we loved to do as children, things like coloring in, dancing, baking, singing, dancing, So things like that, where we go back into rebooting into simplicity, where we can simplify our lives and find little things that can bring us pleasure and be intentional about doing those things as we mourn. I mean, it's a dual process as we mourn what happened, to try and find other things and other ways that don't require much in terms of finances or having to be with other people, those things that do bring us joy. And it will take being quite creative with some of those things, but it usually is the very simple things that used to bring us joy as children and as kids that would help in terms of boosting our mood, boosting how we feel during this time.
Now, just in closing, Charity, there are, of course, those people who would be able to take the advice that you've just given and run with it, implement it. But then there are others, some of us will struggle to do that on our own. So those who need to reach out for further assistance, how can they go about that? Where can they go?
So help certainly is available. We have the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. There's the 24-hour suicide crisis line, so it works 24/7, even on public holidays, even on the major holidays that we'll be celebrating. And the number is 0800 567 567. That's the 24-hour suicide crisis helpline. And there's also the SADAG mental health line, which is 011-234-4837. They are very empathic and trained counselors who will be able to speak to you, and for them to just remind you that you're not alone in this time, and there is help. There is someone to reach out to, and I think it is this time is requiring us to be perseverant. And having to persevere when things are very difficult is quite difficult. And with everything in life, it's nothing ever is permanent. So there is an impermanence to everything that we go through. And this time is part of the impermanence that we experience in life. So it is about having a lot of perseverance. And if you feel that you cannot do it on your own, there is help available. Places like SADAG, the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. Lifeline also has crisis hotlines that you can call, where there can be someone who you can speak to, who can assist you in times of crises.
Well, thank you so much for your time this morning, Charity, clinical psychologist at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, SADAG, Charity Mkone, talking to us about dealing with feelings of isolation, FOMO, resentment, and all other emotions during this festive season. It's been a horrible year because of the coronavirus pandemic, and many will not be able to see their loved ones. But like President Cyril Ramaphosa said, we have to make this sacrifice so that our loved ones can live to see another Christmas.